So we are basically at the beginning of week 3. So you have had, if I'm correct in thinking, 6, 7, 8, 9 reflections so far. Actually, I think most of them are pretty short. I think so. Hopefully, you've been able to mostly keep up. Don't worry if you're not able to. But you know, it's kind of like I try to keep the reflections between 5 minutes and 30 minutes roughly, and then hopefully that gives you enough time to sit and let them percolate in your mind as well. This week, in some respects, is the most important week of Atheism for Lent, because this is the week where atheism and theism are going to start to intertwine. And that's something that I talk about when I promote this course. You've heard me say that we think of atheism and theism as separate things that kind of like stand on different sides of a debating stage. And I've argued that actually their relationship is much more interesting and much more intertwined. And I've talked about this idea of affirmation, negation, negation of negation, which is basically what is called dialectics in philosophy, where a thesis, a position, gives way to its critique, and that critique gives way to another critique, and that second critique, the critique of critique, opens up a new affirmation, becomes a new type of positive position, and then that can be negated, and then that negation is negated into a new affirmation. And that's the process that now is kicking off, right? So in the first few days, week 1, we had, broadly speaking, because think about each week as a painting, right? So we're painting a picture. And the first week was traditional theism, the belief in God, looking at those arguments. And this year, I went for the kind of philosophical arguments. And I think I said to you last week, I'm glad I did that in one way, but also I know it's maybe a boring way to start. I think next year I'm going to take the less philosophical arguments, but the ones that are more persuasive, like existentially. So I might do that next year to mix it up. So this year I went for the rigorous ones, and you get a sense of, okay, these are the arguments for God. And we did already talk about this, that those arguments are generally in their original context not designed to persuade anybody. They're more designed as a type of faith-seeking understanding. So a person might find themselves already believing in God, and then they want to be more rigorous in what they mean by that, and those arguments have often been used to do that. Then we've looked last week at a lot of the kind of traditional atheist arguments. And I tried to give you some of the best. New atheism fits very neatly actually with the week that you've just done. And I'll just double check and make sure you can hear me good. Sometimes I talk and someone says the audio's off or something, so no one's cracked up, right? The arguments of new atheism, some of them are strong, some of them are weak or whatever, but these were kind of like, I think, some of the strong versions of these atheistic critiques. And this, where you've come to this point, is probably not very new to you. Even if the arguments are new, even if the people are new, that notion of affirmation and negation is very common. But that's where things usually stop. And I hear all the time people say to me, they use the terms Christian or atheist, right? And just in conversation, you go, that person's not a Christian, they're an atheist. As if, atheism stands opposed as a negation to Christianity. And that's a very kind of like, it's not something you even think about. It's the kind of water in which many of us swim. But this week is going to begin to kind of make that much more nuanced. And we're going to discover a form of atheism that is embedded within the Christian tradition. Oh yes, so a form of atheism, there's forms of atheism in other religions as well, but primarily we're looking at the Christian tradition here. but that there's a form of atheism that is a purification, a type of spiritual practice that's actually even more radical than a lot of the kind of atheistic critiques that you saw last week. And the first kind of theological form of atheism that I think is systematic and rigorous is the mystics. It starts with someone called Pseudo-Dionysius, and this idea that there is things that we can know, things that exist, and there's things that don't exist. But God, if God means anything, means a reality that is hyper-present, that is so real we cannot conceptualize or experience. And this tradition is very, very rich and leads to a lot of the discussions that we'll be looking at in future weeks. The first person you're looking at is Maimonides, who has a very famous argument, which is called cataphatic theology, which is a theology of negation, that basically every time you say something about God, you're not saying something positive. At best, you're saying, like, if you're saying God is good, you don't mean good like us. There's a certain, and so the language of negation, the language of deletion, of erasure, is more appropriate, or the language of poetics is kind of more appropriate kind of discourse. So this is the mystics. And if you think of them, I was thinking about what would a mystical response be to someone like A.J. Ayer, who you looked at last week. So A.J. Ayer, as you remember, he says the burden of proof lies on the theist. So the negative atheist doesn't need to put arguments forward for why they don't believe. What they do is they wait for someone to present an argument. So if you're the theist and I'm the atheist, and the negative atheist, I'm going to say to you, listen, tell me what you mean by God, right? Tell me what you mean by that term, and tell me why you believe. And in good faith, right? I want to do that in good faith. And I think A.J. Ayer wanted to do that in good faith. And then I let you explain to me the concept of God and why you believe in that. And then I critique it back and forth and, see if I'm persuaded. And I looked at some responses to that argument. So one of the famous responses is from the Reformed epistemologists, people like Alvin Plantinga, who he kind of turns it on its head. And he argues, well, no, the burden of proof is actually on the atheist, right? And then there's others who want to say, well, the burden of proof actually lies equally with both parties. Both parties actually kind of believe the same number of things. It doesn't look like it, so the negative atheist says, I don't believe in God. But there is hidden within that certain affirmations. Just like if I say, I don't believe that science can reveal truth. Right? If I say that, I don't believe science can reveal truth about the universe. That is a negation. I'm not affirming anything. I'm saying something I don't believe in. But if you poke at that enough, you'll find there's an affirmation in it, which is I'm saying I'm believing that language does not touch physical reality. So the scientific method only tells us about the mind, only tells us about kind of how human beings see the world, not the world as it is. So there is actually an affirmation in it, and that's the argument. So those are a couple of arguments we looked at last week. But the mystic who would listen to Ayer would take the position of A.J. Ayer, would say, and they would take both positions in a way, right? They would say, every time I have a concept of God, I need to pick it apart and critique it. Because any time that I reduce God to some object of knowledge or even experience, what I'm doing is I'm creating an idol, an idolatry. Idolatry coming from the term eidos, and eidos was where we get ideology and this kind of the idea of essence, that we can know the essence of God. That is idolatry. And so there has to be this even more radical atheism than Ayer, which is the idea that it's not that you'll ever get a concept that is appropriate. The word is the signifier. The signifier God is a unique signifier because it signifies something that you cannot grasp. It signifies something that is beyond all conception. And so atheism becomes not an enemy, not a necessary evil, not even like as iron sharpens iron, you can kind of like gradually get a better and a better understanding, which some people think within the church sometimes is that what happens is the more you deconstruct, the more you'll be able to reconstruct something better. So you knock down the old house so you can build a better house. The mystics want to kind of go all the way and go, no, there is no reconstruction, because that reconstruction, no matter how good it is still an idolatry. To use an analogy, you could say that theology is like architecture. It's a building. In the aftermath of an event, I'll come back to what I mean by event in a second, but in the aftermath of something, this event that we might call religious experience, you might build a little shack of a theology, right? So you're not a very good architect, you build a little shack, and that's your theology. Or you could build a great chapel, a great cathedral. And the cathedral is better than the shack, right? But both of them are just responses, worshipful responses to an event that is beyond all conception. And someone like Thomas Aquinas, funnily enough, although he's in week 1, and this is one of the things to keep in mind, is just because I put somebody in a particular week, very few people will be boxed there. I'm just using them to paint a picture of a certain way of thinking. So someone like Thomas Aquinas, at the end of his life, he had an experience at Mass, and he said, "What I've experienced today has made everything I've written but straw. I shall write no more." And he stopped writing, and soon after that he died. And it's not that he rejected everything he wrote. He just knew that no matter how great the corpus of knowledge and of insight he had, it was but straw in comparison to this event of God that is beyond all knowledge. So here you can begin to see, hopefully, how the mystical tradition, by and large, takes on all of the atheistic critiques, and in fact often has developed some of those themselves. Even someone like Karl Barth, has a very strong kind of atheistic dimension to some of his work. One of his most famous book is the Epistle to the Romans, where he basically argues that God is the great no, a great crisis that doesn't kind of help us understand or build. It kind of, God is a wrecking ball that smashes things. And being kind of in the event of God is an experience of radical unknowing. In fact, one of the reflections this week is from a little book by an anonymous writer called The Cloud of Unknowing. And so that phrase, into the cloud of unknowing, or the dark night of the soul, is an attempt to articulate this radical kind of theological atheism. There's numerous brilliant thinkers who have talked about how atheism is closer to God than theism. People like Simone Weil, who might be in this year's course, can't remember if I kept her in, but she's been in all of the previous ones. Heidegger said that, Paul Tillich has said that, a guy called Ernst Bloch has said that, Slavoj Žižek. Various thinkers have talked about atheism as this radical negation that is not opposed to the affirmation of God, but somehow deepens it. You could say that the word God for some of these mystical writers, and it's again difficult to pile all these people into the term mystical. I almost want to say that a lot of the theological thinkers that we'll encounter in the next few weeks are thinkers of the other and are thinkers of otherness. And what I mean by that, philosophers use the word other with a capital O, often to signify something that is utterly beyond us, something that we cannot reduce to understanding, to a reflection of ourselves. And that term, it remains very alive, and we're going to look at that, as I say, in future weeks. So these are thinkers of radical otherness. And otherness is so central to what it is to be human. And by that, what I mean is we are driven by what we do not have. We are driven by what we do not understand, by what we cannot articulate. Even the very beginnings of language. Language kind of comes about as an attempt to name things, to understand things. And the frustration and the inability to say something actually generates this multiplicity of words. Poetry is most alive when it's trying to speak of something that it can't articulate. That's when the language becomes richest, whenever it's kind of stretched to breaking point, and stretched to such a point that something sublime kind of shines through. It's like the example of if you say to somebody, words cannot describe how much I love you. That's a failure, right? Words cannot describe how much I love you. In a way, that is a failure of language. But it's a successful failure, right? It's a failure that succeeds in its failure. Like, that is really the best way to express love. Not necessarily in those exact words, but expressing love through articulating the failure to be able to express it, right? And then to use analogies. It actually communicates what it seems to not be able to communicate. The sublime kind of like shines through the cracks. And even desire itself. We desire to go places we've never been. The scientist, the biologist is interested in what they do not know. The physicist is looking at the cosmos and asking the questions about what we don't yet have an answer for. So you could say that to be human is to be drawn to small o otherness, right? Small o otherness is anything we don't currently know, but we could know. I love watching YouTube videos of things that I don't know anything about. And it might be computer programming. I was recently looking at how microchips work. I don't know how they work. And it's like, so I watch YouTube videos on this, and I'm drawn by, I'm sure many of you have done this, if you're late at night, watch some YouTube video on some random thing, and it's really interesting. So small o otherness is you're drawn to things that you do not know. Big O otherness is the idea that there is potentially something that is not provisionally unknown, right? Unknown because we don't currently know it, but it's also possible that there is a dimension to reality that is inherently unknown. Now, what the mystics talk about is they say that something remains through the most radical negation and questioning of that, the most radical atheistic pulling apart of all of our conceptions of what that might be. Something persists. And someone like Jean-Luc Marion, he uses the term counter experience. He doesn't say you have a religious experience, he would say you have a religious counter experience. It's a kind of experience at the limits of experience. It's a paradoxical form of experience. Now, one way to understand this is one of the videos I was watching a while back was some people here are mathematicians. I've watched some of those YouTube videos, and one of them was talking about, could we experience something that was, say, a five-dimensional object in three-dimensional space, right? So you have something of 5 dimensions. Is that something that is completely impossible for us to have any experience of? And the response is, well, no, we could, right? And the way it can be explained is if you imagine living on a 2-dimensional plane, right? So you live in 2 dimensions, and a 3-dimensional object comes into that experience, right? Comes into your two-dimensional world. What would it look like? So imagine a sphere, right? You have a sphere, so three-dimensional object, and it goes into a two-dimensional world. If we're in that two-dimensional world, what we're going to see is a dot that gradually becomes a circle that gets bigger and bigger, and then gradually gets smaller and smaller back into a dot. Right? So if you imagine the sphere going onto a page, as soon as the sphere touches the page, there's a dot on the page. And then if you can imagine the sphere going through that page, that dot would become like a circle. You know, the circumference of the sphere, you would see the circle grow, and as the sphere passes through the piece of paper, then the circle would get smaller and smaller into a dot. And in a similar way, the mystics talk about certain types of experience that kind of the individual feels is being touched by something completely other, right? So and this bedazzlement, decentering experience, paradoxical experience. Burning bush is a good example of like a paradoxical experience. Marion calls this a saturated phenomenon. You know, saturation where you're kind of so overwhelmed, bedazzled. It's a trauma. Now, again, without getting too overly spiritual, there's very natural versions of this. So trauma is an example of this. One way of thinking about a trauma is that it is an experience that you do not have the symbolic ability to grasp. It overwhelms you. So it's happening. So like children have traumas all the time, right? In the sense of they're feeling things, whether it's hunger or coldness or illness. They don't have the language to be able to understand what they're feeling. So, but they're still feeling it. There's something going on that short circuits them. And that short circuiting is a little bit like what a lot of the mystics talk about as religious experience. It is radically transforming, and we're unable to kind of put it into our categories of understanding, but we cannot help but be in awe and fear and wonder at this event. Now, I don't want to say too much. I'm not actually going to introduce the individual readings. I want you to come across them and experience them for yourselves. But what I'll say is this is, from a philosophical perspective, the question is, well, is that a reasonable position to have, right? And that's not something I want to get too deeply into, but people like Jean-Luc Marion, who I mentioned, is a philosopher who says that actually this makes total sense. It is possible that there is some absolute other God, right, that we can feel overwhelmed and short-circuited by, but unable to grasp. That is theoretically possible. Anselm says the same thing. For Anselm, he says, well, there are things that exist in reality and that we can conceptualize. There are things that exist only in our mind, right, that don't exist in reality. So let's take a painting. I'm about to paint something. It exists in my mind, but not in reality. And then I paint it. Now it exists in my mind and it exists in reality. And then he says it's possible that something can exist in reality but cannot be contained by the mind. And he says, and if that exists, that would be God, right? God is the signifier of something. For the mystics, God is the signifier of something that exists in reality but cannot be contained by thought or experience. And this opens up something incredible. Like the mystical tradition remains alive and well in the scientific world and in the world of philosophy, in the world of theology, in that what is birthed through that tradition is the idea that nothingness or otherness is as important as what we can see and what is the same. So if we think of otherness and sameness, and we think of something and nothing, otherness, and like you could say like the only important stuff is what exists, and the only stuff that we really can know is stuff that is similar to us, right? And everything else is unimportant. If something's completely other, who cares? And if something doesn't exist, it's of no relevance to us. And that's a common sense kind of idea. But even with something like mathematics took a massive leap forward when they symbolized nothing, right? Zero, right? Zero for some was a very threatening thing, right? There was a theological dimension to that. I don't know how big this really is. I think there's controversy about it, but there's definitely some in the church where did not want zero, because there is no lack, there is nothing, there is no nothing, and to signify zero, to signify lack, is in a way they thought unchristian, right? So, but zero was this signifying of nothingness that is, of course, incredibly important. And then we have negative numbers, which are even more interesting: -1, -2, -3, and then imaginary numbers, etc., and real numbers. So there is increasingly an interest in not simply what exists, but the importance in our lives of what doesn't exist, or we cannot conceptualize. Again, trauma is a good example of something that happens that is, in a way, other, but incredibly real. Another example would be a lot of us have alternative worlds in our minds. So we're existing in a world where we're married to a particular person, or we got a divorce, or we lost a job, or we live in a world where we have a whole pile of experiences, but we have alternative worlds where things are different, where we're with a person that we're not with, where we took a different path in our lives, right? That alternative universe doesn't exist, right? It's just a fiction. It doesn't exist, but it has a real impact in your life. And sometimes you have to give up those worlds. We have to realize that those worlds are fantasies, right? And that are actually making us depressed. So we live not just in terms of the life that we have, we also weirdly live in worlds in which don't exist. The other thing about being human is we don't just live with who we are. Part of us is who we want to be, who we long to be, who we regret not being. To be human is to live also between what we have and what we don't have, right? So it's not just what we have, it's what we don't have is important as well. So the mystics are part of this. They're saying, well, God kind of like is an interesting signifier of something that is the most important thing, that is not a thing, that doesn't exist, at least does not exist like regular objects. So for the mystics, God hyper-exists. God exists in such a superabundant form that we cannot speak of God. And so atheism then becomes, as I say, this purification process. And it's a radical atheism, because a lot of philosophical atheism is provisional. It's like, you may come up with a concept that I believe in. I don't currently believe in any of the concepts of God that I've heard, but if I'm a consistent atheist, then I have to admit that maybe you'll come up with a concept that I will be convinced by. Whereas the mystics are even more radical atheists, because they say there will never be a concept of God that lives up to God, right? So it's an atheism which in advance shuts off any possible conception of God as an idolatry. Now, the week after this, we're then going to see a negation of this. And then the week after that, we're going to see this other negation of negation. And we're going to see how this notion of otherness can express itself in kind of different ways. But this is really the first, and the reason why I'm saying this is kind of such an important week is because this is the first point where it's very hard to go, where does atheism stop and theism start? Right, where they're so the mystic will always welcome the atheistic critique. The more, the better. One of the most famous I think this is in the reflections, this line in Meister Eckhart's, I pray God rid me of God, right? Which is this idea of like every time I say God, it is less than God. So my prayer to God is to rid me of God. And in that movement between naming and unnaming, that's the space of faith, right? And Marion calls this the space of denomination. So to nominate means to name, to denominate means to unname. And so the person of faith nominates and then denominates. They say God and they say that is less than God. And I like the term denomination. Churches are called denominations, right? They are the places where you should dename. They are the places where we try to rid ourselves of this kind of idolatry. This is why Rudolf Otto, who again is a reflection this week, he you'll see in his work that he says that the experience of a fear and a terror and a kind of awe-inspiring shuddering is the kind of the basis of the religious experience. That's it. It's the basis of the religious faith is not some sort of intellectual affirmation, but a sense of awe at something holy, wholly other. Something wholly other that we find ourselves caught up in. And so the mystic is not someone who's going to argue for God or for some sort of object, but they will speak of a kind of sense of a traumatic type of encounter or event or a traumatic form of experience in which they feel undone, some otherness that calls to them and that they want to live in fidelity to, that they want to find a way to do justice to in song, in speech, and in works. Protecting that experience, so not kind of like reducing it to some idol, to some ethos, to some idolatry, to some ideology, but to somehow have an expansive language that is a type of praise. So let's say a theopoetics rather than a kind of a theology. So that's basically what you're going to encounter this week. And there's some music, there's some different kinds of ways to go about that. And I think that's all I want to say about the mystics. Yes. So to be clear then, this is the first week in which you'll experience the negation of negation. This is the first week where hopefully you will understand dialectics by just feeling it, just saying, oh, right, okay, these now are coming together in a kind of interesting and more rich way. Yes, this notion of God, the three-letter word God, as a signifier that signifies something that cannot be signified, right? That's why it's a unique signifier. Maybe there are other signifiers that do this. In psychoanalysis, there's the term the phallus, which is similar. It signifies something that doesn't exist. But yeah, God is a word in language that tries to have a space for something that is not reducible to even not reducible to economy. It's not something that can be bought or sold. It's not something that can be grasped. And this is very key in terms of the contemporary world, where increasingly, the only thing that counts is kind of like what Byung-Chul Han talks about, the world of pure positivity, the world of achievement, the world where everything is possible and where there is no real otherness. There is otherness, things that you don't have, but you can achieve. You can kind of try and get those things. You can try to be whole and complete. You can try to almost you've got a superego, a conjunction to enjoy and to have. And then Byung-Chul Han talks about the need to be lazy and to the need to kind of create a space where you realize there is a kind of like a whole within reality, H-O-L-E. So the holy is a whole, right? The holy is a whole in stuff. It's something that cannot be stopped up. and that we need some experience of that. So there was this Russian sect that would cut a hole in the wall of their home and they would pray to the hole. So unlike having icons, the gap itself became holy. There's something about that is key to the mystics, that we need a dimension of space. We need a dimension that we cannot colonize, we cannot fully grasp. And that's what the mystics kind of call God. Now I say for the mystics it's a hyper-presence. It's something that is more real than anything else. But it's complicated. So like someone like Meister Eckhart, sometimes he'll talk about superabundance and sometimes it will be like pure negation. It's and the womb and a type of nothingness. So this idea of excess and lack, kind of like they become a little bit interchangeable because both of them express something that you can't grasp, right? And that kind of opens up a much more interesting dialogue between theism and atheism. So I'm going to look to see what questions you have, and we'll take it from there. Let's see. Oh, Courtney says, I don't remember anything from AJ Eyre this week. Was it AJ Eyre? Am I wrong? Oh, Anthony Flew. Sorry, it was Anthony Flew. Thank you. Sorry, Courtney. We didn't do AJ Eyre. I don't know why he was in my mind. He will be in a future Atheism for Lent. But yes, Anthony Flew. That's who I meant. Oh yes, now I confused everybody because someone else is going like, oh, I think maybe AJ Eyre's coming next week. No, AJ Eyre was this kind of, he also had a radical kind of atheistic argument. He kind of argued just that the arguments for God or against God are utterly meaningless. So, and that was his kind of position. So that was confusing. Oh, Chris Ayres says, yeah, someone once asked Rowan Williams, then Archbishop of Canterbury, how he got on with Richard Dawkins, as they were both lecturers in the same Oxford College. And then Williams said, there isn't a problem. That God he doesn't believe in, I don't believe in either. Yes, that is the answer of the mystics in many respects, is the God that is not believed in by atheists is also the God that the mystics don't believe in. And that's what someone like Simone Weil means by atheism closer to God. It's like, yes, this purification process, the same God you don't believe in, we don't believe in. There's an argument that some atheists have used. Ricky Gervais said this once. It's a good one, but he says, like, you're all atheists about lots of gods, right? If you get an encyclopedia of gods and there's 300 gods in it, you don't believe in 299 of them. You just believe in one. And I just don't believe in that one either, right? But then the mystics' response to that is, yes, no, you're absolutely right. We actually, every conception of God, all 300 in the encyclopedia, are attempts to grasp what cannot be grasped. And theology at its most mature is a deconstructive theology. So theology at its best is a type of language that auto-deconstructs itself, that leaves room for the radical unknowing. And so you see this, for example, in the Hebrew scriptures, where you have, interestingly, lots of names for God. So, and these names often contradict, right? So it's like God is a peacemaker, God is a warrior, God who hears everything, God who's deaf and doesn't hear something, right? God, there's all of these names of God that clash. And that's quite Kantian. Remember in the antinomies you looked at, where Kant says you kind of, the problem is not that reason doesn't get you anywhere, it gets you to mutually exclusive places. Well, a lot of the writers, the Jewish writers, they played with this. They knowingly kind of had a multiplicity of names, precisely to remind you that the names fail, that none of the names kind of like work, or they work when they're in some sort of analogous kind of way. And then in the midst of the Hebrew scriptures, then you also have the I am, right? The kind of this unnameable name of God. And of course you have the tetragrammaton, this notion of the word God can't even be pronounced. So you have all of these strategies that kind of remind you that no, it's not the case that the believers disbelieve in 299 gods but believe in that 300th. It's that there is a type of language that protects God, that denames God in the naming of God. Someone was saying the audio wasn't good, but somebody else said it was all right, so hopefully it's okay. Oh yes, Courtney said the discussion of the 5-dimensional object in the 3-dimensional universe reminds me of Flatland. Yes, that's, I remember Flatland. I've never read it. Is it just a short story? It's just a little short story, isn't it? Because I know of it, and I know the concept where it's people who live in a 2-dimensional world, isn't it? So yeah. The reason why I use that example is that some mystics, they write in a very sophisticated way about very unique types of experience that, as I say, Marion calls counter experience, that is similar to the sphere coming into the 2-dimensional object. So whenever you read Rudolf Otto this week, he's one of those people who, he says, like, there's a certain form of tremor, of awe and terror that is, I mean, it's kind of like anxiety, right? Anxiety does not have a traditional object, right? So fear, the way people often think about it is fear has an object and anxiety doesn't. Now, just to, if anyone is into their psychoanalysis, the idea anxiety does have a type of object, but it's not the type of object that fear has. And that's kind of what Rudolf Otto is saying, is that in human experience, there are affects that are best understood as encounters with something wholly other. This is moving. Let's see. There's lots of conversation here. This is good. John, let's see. If negative theology is grounded in the notion of plenitude beyond us, how do you relate this to lack as absence in Lacan? And that's a great question. So what John's asking is, and I think it was it Dawn last week? Is it Dawn's your name? Who was kind of like seeing where this is going. John, you're kind of seeing where this will go. Is I'm trying to, and it's very hard for me to do this, I'm trying to stick with what the mystics are saying, which is, John uses the word plenitude, right? So the mystics, and Anselm is key in this. Anselm is basically saying God is an excess, a plenitude, an overwhelming experience. Just like I mentioned the child who has an overwhelming experience when they're young, that marks them. And that can be a very negative experience. I mean, trauma can be very negative, but it's an overwhelming experience that short circuits you. And that's the mystical understanding, is plenitude. God is hyper real. And so that's why we can't name God. And then John is saying, well, how does that connect with the idea of lack, negation, negativity? If you were listening to my conversations with Richard Boothby a few weeks ago, you'll know we talked a lot about that. So yes, all I'll say, John, is this is interesting, and that's where we'll go in about 2 or 3 weeks. We'll kind of get into that Lacanian notion of negativity, and I think they are interestingly related. So let's see if we can kind of unpick that in whenever we get to kind of the contemporary debates. But yeah, it's good that John mentioned plenitude, because that is a really important word for the mystics, for people like Pseudo-Dionysius, where God is, as I say, a hyper-presence, a hyper-reality. And it's like being sunken in the depths of the ocean, a ship sunk in the depths of the ocean. I don't know which mystic used this analogy, but it was somebody said, like, the ship is full of the ocean and the ocean is full of the ship, right? But the ship only contains a fragment of the ocean, but the ocean contains the entire ship. That's plenitude. God is the ocean. We are submerged. We are saturated. And it's pure plenitude. So hopefully we'll make those connections in a couple of weeks. Uh, oh yeah, Tibu says, and this is about last week, but I like what you're saying, so I'll bring it up. You said, would the handicap of non-existence found in Gaskell's proof from last week be a feature, not a bug, a lack within God? So, Tim, so the last one you did, which I hope you enjoyed, I think it's very funny, is the ontological argument for the non-existence of God. Timo, you're saying exactly kind of what I want to do with that argument, and I'm going to use it in the book that I'm writing, that in a way, like, it might be successful in saying that nothingness is a type of, is the potentially the cauldron out of which everything comes and out of which everything arises. So there could be a way of taking that Gaskell's proof, ontological proof, and reading it either in a mystical way. I like what you're saying, because you could almost imagine Meister Eckhart saying that. Like, you could almost imagine that being something that Eckhart would say, and then kind of argue that then the nothing that is God, what he calls the Godhead, the nothing that is the Godhead is out of which everything arises and out of which we become. So you could probably, have a mystical version of that. And I think you could probably have, as John was mentioning, you probably have a Lacanian version of it as well. So there's something in that argument that I think is very, very rich. And I like what you're saying. It's maybe not a bug, but yeah, there's something kind of at least metaphorically useful in it. Stephen Fowler says, this is a good question actually. When you refer to psychoanalysis, are you actually referring to Lacanianism? And that's a good question. Mostly when I talk about psychoanalysis, yes, the Freudian Lacanian tradition is the primary one I'm referring to. Not actually when I'm talking about trauma. Actually, interestingly, when I was talking about trauma there, that I think is very similar to what Wilfred Bion thinks about. So whenever I said that trauma is a type of overwhelming experience of being overwhelmed by the infant, which is what Freud was talked about in the seduction theory. Which the seduction theory was the idea that a child experiences sometimes abuse, and that abuse they cannot conceptualize in any way. And Stephen, I know you know this, but and that can lead to a whole pile of sexual issues, as an adult. But Bion, he talks about this thing, this experience, and that experience seems to be what you cannot alphabeticize, what you cannot put into language. So, but generally speaking, and I'll always try and say Lacan, but generally speaking, when I'm talking about psychoanalysis, I'm talking about Freud and Lacan. Derek says, where can I read more about these Russian wall hole prayers? I've searched before and come up empty, but I find the idea really compelling. Derek, I'm the same as you. I don't know where I first heard about that. I wrote about it in my first book. I must have been in some seminar, heard about it. I did research, and all I could find was like a few paragraphs about them. Like, they are such a small sect. They seem to exist. So on the Wikipedia page about Russian Orthodoxy, there is, I think it's the Russian Orthodoxy, but there is a well-known kind of Russian Orthodox church, and they are mentioned, and there's a name for them, and they're mentioned. But I have not found anything substantial about them, and I don't think that they are a living tradition necessarily. It might have been a very brief sect. So if anybody does find out stuff, maybe put into chat GPT or whatever and see what that comes up with. But yeah, it seems to be, I'm sure there's stuff written, but I have not done a deep dive, and I found exactly the same as you. I found a few paragraphs about them, and nothing more, just as a sect of the Russian Orthodox. And there's a name for them, I can't even remember the name. Let's see. And Stephen says, Some believers make worship of Jesus what might be almost considered an idolatry. But since New Testament theology identifies Jesus as the image of God, is it legit? I mean, this is interesting. Like someone like Karl Barth, who's very orthodox, he basically says God is a crisis. So he's crisis theologian, right? God is the big no to RESs. God is that which kind of like disrupts our understanding of knowledge and wisdom and all of that. But then, so Barth's theology is very Christocentric, because he says the only thing we can know or talk about is God as revealed, right? So he starts his whole theology, and I think it's an interesting way to go about it. Is it's kind of the aftermath. He goes like, yeah, there's you cannot speak, and he rejects natural theology. There's a little book you can buy of a debate between him and Brunner, where he just absolutely assaults the idea of natural theology, that we can know stuff about God. And for him, basically what the Christian is the person who kind of stands on this kind of idea of a revelation. But Barth also would say that it's not that God is unknown and then Christ makes God known. He would say God is unknown and then Christ makes God known as unknown. So he would kind of say there's an unknowingness that is within the revelation. So it's that there is Barth wants to keep that otherness and that hiddenness within the revelation itself. That's why a lot of theologians do not engage in the arguments for the existence of God. They don't. Even people like Schleiermacher and stuff like that, they start from this idea. So Schleiermacher famously starts from the experience of utter dependence. This idea that I am absolutely dependent, that I feel that I am not my own source, and that I feel that I and everything is utterly dependent. This is this sense, and then out of that, they read, say, the Bible and Christianity and the sayings of Jesus as a way of holding that and making sense of it. I guess I would say this because I'd say that what one would say is the teachings of Jesus do not reveal, or reveal and conceal. So parabolistic speech. You cannot get a theology from Jesus in a way. Like parables both reveal and conceal. Jesus is generally, his way of communicating is one that exposes your own desire to yourself. So Jesus is a type of analyst, a type of psychoanalyst, where people encounter their own heart, their own unconscious desires. So Jesus says different things to different people, and what seems to be of importance is not communicating knowledge of God, but you encountering the truth of yourself, and the truth setting you free. And so I guess, some theologians would say, I don't want to say it, Barth would say this necessarily, but that in a figure like Jesus, you have a type of discourse that reveals and conceals, and that is itself deconstructive. And of course, confessional Christians would say, and Jesus reflects and is God incarnate, so the unknowingness is there. And if I use an analogy, it's like in Newtonian science, there is what you know and what you don't know, and the ultimate unknown in Newtonian science is why the world has these constants. So there's the unknown, God is the unknown, and then everything else can be understood. In contemporary physics, there is an unknown within what we know. There is probability, there's wave particle duality, there's a certain unknowing that is not due to lack of knowledge, but is kind of like part of it. And so Barth would almost say there's the unknowing of God, and then in Christ, that unknowing dwells among us. I don't know if that's answering your question at all, but that was kind of what you sparked in me. And then this actually follows on from Stephen. So how does the mystic wrestle with the incarnation? In a nutshell, maybe I'll stick with what I said to Stephen there, is that for someone like Meister Eckhart, I think what he finds in the Gospels is a type of encounter with this radical otherness. And you could even say the reason why we have 4 Gospels rather than one. And there was a theologian who tried to merge them. Like, you think about it, like, why have evangelicals, for example, not tried to make one gospel, right? Because you'd think that would be something you would do. Because if, for example, you believe, right, the Bible is without error, without contradiction, then it would kind of make sense to just kind of merge them all into one, not to exclude the 4, but you could merge them all into one. But it was Tashian, I think it was pronounced Tashian, who wanted to do this, and he was condemned as a heretic, right? So there's an idea that an event has happened that created 4 different testimonies that don't fit together, that don't neatly nestle in, and that actually that's part of the power of the truth. So in the same way that if someone is in court and they're saying that something very traumatic happened to them, if they're able to give one very consistent way of description, that hints that they're lying. Whereas if what they said to the police and what they said to the judge and what they said to their friends is all a bit different, that points to the truth of something happening, because the trauma kind of like short circuits you until you can't remember days and times. Whereas if you just made it up, you can have a very consistent narrative. In the same way, these 4 Gospels themselves, that very structure kind of like hints at this explosion of the unknown. So, that could be one way of thinking about it, but that's a big question that I'll avoid. Phil's saying he also wants to know. So maybe we need to do something more on that. I would say, like, this is one of the things I like about Richard Boothby's work, is Richard Boothby has given, I think, a really powerful expression of the importance of Jesus within religion and within Christianity. And by that, I mean that what he argues for, but this is we're going 3 weeks ahead, so I won't say too much, but he argues that Jesus gives us an image of someone who says, if you want to experience and encounter the unknown, God, the absolute other, you encounter that by being open to the absolute other within your enemy and within your neighbour. So this is Richard Boothby, is not any best, but this is what I would say, right? So I'm giving you my thoughts here, is that I think what's really interesting about Jesus and what makes Jesus a central figure is not the miracles necessarily or the sayings of Jesus, many of which have been said by other people and have a tradition before him. What was really interesting was that this notion of the unknown remains fundamental within the Gospels, remains fundamental, but the unknown is focused to the human other, to the other. And you can even see this in the Gospels, the New Testament as a whole, where there's this idea that you should love God, and then you get this idea that you should love God and love your neighbour, that they are basically the same, they look alike, right? Love God, love your neighbour. And then later on, I think it's in one of the letters of John, where it just says love your neighbour, right? And in doing that, you're loving God. So it starts, love God with all your heart, then it's kind of love God and love your neighbour, and then it's like, love your neighbour, that's it. And if you love your neighbour, you love God, and if you don't love your neighbour, you don't love God, even if you say you do. So that might be I don't want to say a mystical way of understanding Jesus, but it's definitely what I think, and what Boothby thinks, is that there is something about that Jesus and this idea of otherness. It's central to religion. I mean, if I was to kind of try to articulate what religion is, for me, religion at its best is a sensitivity to other, capital O otherness. That's what it is. Religion in different forms is a type of attempt to wrestle with, to tarry with, to keep open the space of radical otherness. And in the figure of Jesus, it is in the encounter with the other that you encounter this otherness. Don't know if the mystics would say that, but that's what I would say. Oh yes, and Phil looked up Wikipedia. I think old believers, the old ritualists, has them listed as a minor group. Yes, the whole worshippers, Daimiki or something like that, relinquish the use of icons and pray to the east through a hole in the wall. Yeah, the old believers, that's it. So, I mean, Phil, if you get any further than that, great. Although, to be honest, that's the only thing that I'm interested in. Is like, I think it's amazing that there was this group that actually were called the whole worshippers. They literally, the old believers. It's kind of very, very powerful image. Okay, I don't want to take up too much of your time because you've got so much happening, and there's so much happening on the WhatsApp group. I don't know about the others. Facebook I don't really use, but WhatsApp's been very lively, and that's great because you are having a vital conversation with each of these reflections, and also you're seeing a vital conversation. I've kind of artificially constructed a type of vital conversation. And of course it's artificial because some of these people never knew each other. They're different ages. And this week, last week we're looking at people in the 20th century, this week in the medieval period. But what I'm doing is I'm constructing a conversation that is not a chronological, but it is logical, a dialectic conversation that is vital and that is moving forward. And as I say, in the midst of that, you guys are having these conversations about each of the reflections, and we'll see how this continues to move on. So good luck. I think Maimonides is the first one. You've got John Cage in there. You've got Julian of Norwich. You've got Rudolf Otto. You have Meister Eckhart. So there's lots of really cool stuff that you're going to encounter this week.